Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine news update, first part thereof for the 15th of January 2024. Oh, that's a bit better, slightly better light. It's a case of Boomtown rats hitting the Kremlin, because he must hate Mondays. Our friend Vlad, or however you shorten his name, Mr. Putin, the dictator, bad day at the office. We'll get on to that. I've done a breaking news update. Please go and check that out. Although, as with all my videos at the moment, they are taking about 40 minutes plus to upload because I've increased the quality of the resolution of the videos in terms of resolution, and that means they are very slow to upload. Grr. Anyway, let's go to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, and another good day for the Ukrainians here, not only with what we're going to talk about with regard to those big planes that have been taken out of the sky, but actually just generally across the categories. 980 personnel lost is almost 1,000, in case you didn't understand how maths works and numbers. That is a really big loss for the Russians again. Yeah, I think there were claims of troop accumulations being hit recently. I've seen quite a bit of footage of lots of, I see lots of footage all day, every day of things getting blown up, troops getting destroyed. And that kind of stuff just goes on unhaltingly throughout the week, every day. All day and all night, there are things being blown up by different munitions. Even when the weather is bad, there's still operations somewhere along the front line. It's such a long and big front line. It's just the attrition is constant, right? Of course, that's going to be for both sides as well. But 980 personnel loss is a huge loss for the Russians. 14 tanks is another day of big losses. Not the highest, but my goodness, 14 is significant. That's a big number of tanks to lose. 20 APVs, likewise, and 24 artillery systems has that category racking up to, okay, not to the levels where we have seen between 40 and 50 on previous days, but that 24 is a high number of artillery pieces, all things considered. 1 multiple launch rocket system, 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems. As I mentioned earlier in the breaking news update, the Russians are losing anti-aircraft warfare systems at fairly consistent, significant rates. Yeah, 2 doesn't sound like a lot, but 2 a day, that's over the average, right? 2 a day is a lot to lose. That's 14 in a week. That's, just 60, I guess, if I'm going to do some more maths, 60 in a month. That's a lot of anti-aircraft warfare systems to lose if you lose them at that rate. Okay. If you're then adding the occasional bit of radar, electronic warfare system, in the special equipment category, where we have seen this week quite a few lost in that category, then you can imagine that the Russian air defenses and radar capabilities are being seriously degraded. That then causes potentially the Russians to move A-50s, these big radar planes, closer to the front line, and then they get lost. So these figures do have real-world ramifications. This is all connected. Anyway, to go further on, 31 vehicles and fuel tanks is a significant number in that category to lose. That will affect their ability to carry out logistics. And 3 pieces of special equipment work. It just depends what they are. That's a wide remit for that category. So we're going to go first to what I talked about in the breaking news, but just very briefly, 2 big airplanes have been shot down. Question is, by whom? So you've got an A-50, which is a very high value, very capable radar plane that the Russians do kind of rely on quite a bit. They don't have too many of these, and they've already had some damaged previously, at least one damage in Belarus at the airbase there by a drone that went over the border. Really big loss, as well as this command plane in IL-22M, it seems. One of these was shot down by Wagner, actually, that caused the loss of 10 VKS specialists and pilots and whatnot. Really high value plane in terms of the equipment, but also the expertise that were lost then. Well, this one appears to have been hit and damaged and did an emergency landing. They were wounded. Don't know the exact outcome there. So anyway, the reports were that initially the Ukrainians shot down both these planes, and the Russians started admitting on social media and elsewhere that this is a tragedy, and it's a tragedy as a result of Russian air defense. This happened around the Sea of Azov last night. With one, well, as it says here, it seems at the very least that the IL-22 suffered damage, according to Kiev Independent. The 4-engine propeller-driven IL-22, which carries up to 10 people and helps to relay radio signals and coordinate frontline operations, was struck along the Sea of Azov coast Sunday night. The Russian Air Force has just 30 of these variants, and after the mutinous Wagner Group mercenaries shot one down. And yeah, it's only slightly less rare than the Beriev early warning planes. That's the other one. So these are two rare, expensive planes that the Russians can ill afford to lose. There was an intercept of the communications from the plane back to the airfield dispatcher in Anapa to suggest that indeed they needed ambulances, fire trucks, and evacuation. So things were not well. Obviously, the plane was on fire and people were injured, and it crash landed. That's the implication there. The Russians came out and then claimed that this was air defense, Russian air defense shooting them down. Tragedy is always a tragedy. This is fighter bomber who is a Russian pilot, has his own Telegram channel. When he starts announcing stuff about Russian losses, you take it seriously because that is a Russian admitting to Russian losses. So it's much more likely to be true. So the narrative from the Russians is this was shot down by air defenses, but then the narrative from the Ukrainians, and it's fairly official, is that it was that both of them were shot down by the Ukrainians. So here is sources in the HUI, the Ukrainian military intelligence, confirming to the Kiev Post that the Ukrainians were responsible. And then subsequent to that, Budanov has come out and admitted that. And now Zaluzhny has now confirming that both were shot down and destroyed by the Ukrainians. Okay, so both sides are trying to control the narrative here. Tendar says, last night Russia lost with certainty a Beriev A-50 airborne early warning and control plane, so it's worth about up to $350 million. The plane costing around $350 million US dollars. It was a vital asset, vital for air asset coordination in the entire region. Russian channels, he says, focus on aviation, confirming the loss as air defense. In addition, a Russian Ilyushin IL-20M or IL-22M was also hit in this area and signaled Mayday, including the attempt for an emergency landing in Anapa, Russia, as well as a request for ambulances. So we don't know what happened after it. It did lose radar signal, so it went off the map, basically. It went dark. That could signify that it crash landed and that's the end of that. There's no information that a plane arrived at the destination, but even if it did, then it was certainly severely damaged. The cause of both incidences is still a matter of speculation, but the fact that two valuable Russian birds got hit in the same time and at the same region make enemy fire the most plausible explanation. So Tendal says it's more likely the Ukrainians shot them down. John Bridge, on the other hand, says for what it's worth, in the absence of specific explanation or evidence, I am somewhat skeptical that it was Ukrainian Patriot air defenses. There are ways Ukraine could have executed this, such as a maximum range Patriot engagement from very close to the front line. But on its face, a Russian friendly fire incident seems more plausible. So still kind of a bit 50-50 about that, or maybe just siding more on the Russian account of what's taken place there. And it's in response to Budanov claiming that it was the Ukrainians who shot them down. Remember, but the Ukrainians are going to want to say it was them because it makes them look cool. The Russians are going to want to say it was their own cock up, because actually granting the Ukrainian the bragging rights to the success over shooting down the Russian planes is not in the Russians' best interest. So actually, although it's embarrassing, it's less embarrassing if the Russians shot their own plane down than if they accepted that the Ukrainians shot it down. So that's why I think the Russians are saying that, and why the Ukrainians are saying what they're saying. But who knows? Either way, it's a good day for the Ukrainians. A really, really good day. So moving on, I don't have an Andrew Perpetua list today. He hasn't done one at time of recording, so I'll just go on. It's been reported that Ukraine has eliminated a high-ranking invader in occupied Crimea. Russia's commander of the 43rd Separate Sea Assault Aviation Regiment was denazified during Ukraine's attack on Saki airfield last week. So this is another high-ranking official that died in those strikes on Crimea. We heard of an air defense regiment head being taken out as well. Russian lost another air defense system on the left bank. Russian crew was reportedly temporarily alive while flying into an unknown direction. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. That they are people. But that again reflects how difficult a time the Russians are having with air defense systems, and well, particularly in the area of Krinky, where they're struggling an awful lot with having a lot of equipment taken out by the Ukrainians. It is, I just get this sense that at a time where the Russians are supposed to be on the attack, they are getting a bloody nose on quite a number of occasions. And remember, this is happening without that $61 billion package of kit that the Americans have, are due to give the Ukrainians. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next video. But even given the lack of that money, the Ukrainians are doing an incredibly good job. Imagine what they could do with that kit, with ATACMS, with Taurus. Goodness me. Here we have, and I can't show it to you, but it's a tank, I think a T-80 BVM, just driving along in the muddy fields here, and it gets taken out by this drone. And my goodness, it explodes. So it hits just the back of the turret there. And I don't know whether, surely it's not going to be that drone that has that explosive capability. It must have somehow been able to detonate the ammo rack underneath or something. But my goodness, big explosion of that tank. Just something for, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, to look at. Hotel Astoria on fire. So we've got more examples of Russia on fire. And this is just a continued thorn in the side of Russia at the moment. It's a significant fire on a big hotel, or a hotel in a shopping mall associated with the shopping mall in Kazan in Russia. And yeah, lots of footage of that. I mean, goodness me, these are massive fires. As I've said before, if that fire happened in the UK, that would be the annual news event in terms of fires in the UK easily. Right, we had Grenfell. We had another one where a suburb almost sort of burnt down with some heath fire, or like field fires that took place. But generally, they are very rare in the UK. These fires are happening virtually every single day in Russia, and that has to tell you something. And another fire here, thick black smoke bellowed out across Rostov. It seems like a car wash and a service centre caught light, soon spreading to over 100 square meters. Again, I've said this before, but we know the Ukrainians are paying Russians to do this. Like, this has come out. It's just how many of these are, sabotage events, how many are insurance jobs, how many are partisans. But this would be a low risk, high reward approach for Ukraine. I think that to pay people in a country where there's probably quite a large number of people who would happily take that money, in terms of not just ideology, but in terms of, like, I'm skint at the moment, things are bad, I live in the sticks or whatever. Yeah, I'd happily take a couple of $1,000 US, and for a couple of $1,000 US, Ukrainians could cause havoc in places all around Russia, I think, and I think that must be partly what's going on. Right, now going on to distant strikes. So this is a return to the idea that Russian missiles are going astray, so they're not reaching their targets, and B, Russia, the claim is that over 20 Russian missiles didn't reach their targets in that big strike the other day. Then you've got they're not reaching their targets because they are poor missiles, and there's something going wrong with the quality of the missiles, and that could be sanctions, it could be whatever it is. Or B, electronic warfare is becoming much more effective. Someone was saying yesterday, as a speculative theory, saying, have you thought that maybe with these new defense manufacturing facilities being set up by outside entities, which is happening, and we know that it's the defense military industrial complex that the Russians are aiming at the moment. If Western manufacturers are setting up shop in Ukraine, could it be that they would say, we will set up shop, but we are going to have some electronic warfare devices associated with our own facility, because we need to protect our investment. We're not going to get a return on investment from a economic point of view, from a financial point of view, if our facilities are getting blown up. So we need the best. We're a defense military industrial concern. We're going to put our very best electronic warfare system on top of or nearby this facility. I'm sure the Ukrainians will be like, yep, totally. But it could be that as you're getting more and more Western entities set up shop in Ukraine, Ukraine becomes more and more capable in its electronic warfare and air defense. I don't know. It's just pure speculation, but it came from one of my commenters, and actually that seems pretty plausible. Anyway, going back to the first reason as to why missiles aren't finding, because what we want to do is build up a picture of what's going on in reality, right? How do we get the most accurate appraisal and sense of the world, right? And in this case, the war in Ukraine. And we have all these competing theories and all these competing claims from both sides, and they all have their agendas, and pro-Ukrainians have their agenda, pro-Russians have their agenda, and we're kind of in the middle saying, well, I'm morally pro-Ukrainian, but I also really want to have an accurate understanding of what's going on. So I don't want to believe that just because, so the Ukrainians said, oh, more than 20 missiles didn't find their target. Well, that sounds cool, and I want to believe that because it's good news for me as a pro-Ukrainian. But actually, am I justified in believing it? So then you start looking at these different elements of the claim and pieces of the jigsaw, and you piece it together. And so that theory about Western concerns setting up shop in Ukraine is interesting, but it's not evidence. It's kind of rational evidence. It's not hard evidence. Like, we haven't actually seen that, but that's plausible. Okay, and then I reported that there was a missile that didn't reach the target. It didn't even get out of Russia. It fell in Krasnodar, and I showed you this footage. Actually, it turns out there were two in one day in the same area. So 2 Russian caliber missiles fell in Krasnodar region on the same day, Astra Telegram channel sources report. The first missile fell on the morning of January the 13th between Pavlovskaya and Atamanskaya, rural localities seen in a video. Local authorities called it an unidentified device. The fact that it was a caliber missile was reported by military expert Yan Matviev, and the same conclusion was reached in a conversation with Astra by CIT military analysts who analysed photos and video of the fallen missile. This information was later confirmed by Astra sources in the region's emergency services. Okay. As it turned out, this is not the only Russian missile that fell in Krasnodar region that day. In the evening of January the 13th, the fall of the caliber missile was also recorded in Leningradsky district. It fell in a field near Zapadny farm. No casualties or damage were reported. So that is 2. There were 38 missiles that went into Ukraine, and over 20 of them apparently didn't reach their targets. But so really, with these 2, that's 40 missiles sent, okay? And 2 of them didn't even get, and there could be more. So at least 2 of them didn't even get to Ukraine. So that's 2 out of 40. So that's 5 out of 100. That is 5%. 5% of missiles, in this case, failed to get out of Russia. So when they are claiming that 20 missiles didn't reach their target, we are at least somewhat justified in thinking that that is true, or at least it's definitely plausible, and it is in part evidenced here. So, yeah, I think we are justified in believing what the Ukrainians say to some degree. Explosions are being reported in occupied Melitopol, so this is yesterday, and Belgorod and Kursk regions of Russia. So yesterday, there was still Ukrainian attacks on Russian targets within both occupied territories in Ukraine and into Russia as well. Okay, now on to other bits and pieces. And we're going to return again, like I do keep returning to Russia on Fire, because I think it is important to keep building this picture up of what's going on inside Russia. We're going to return again to the issue with heating and energy in Russian cities. Yet more Russia suffering in the cold. Hashtag Russia is collapsing. And this time residents of Novomoskovsk are left without heat. Media say that 125,000 residents were disconnected. Regional officials in Tula later said they restored power by using a backup heat supply line. The other new revelation comes from Moscow region. Goodness knows how many more are freezing without media attention across Russia. Astra Media reports locals in Yakroma have been freezing for 3 days, but local bosses and media lie that all is well. So this is continuing to happen. And Anton Gershchenko says, you won't believe it, but yet another town in Russia is without heat. And Novomoskovsk, so he's going to give more details about this, in Tula region, 372 residential buildings, 16 kindergartens and a hospital are without heat because of an incident at a local electricity station. Quote, all resources and means are directed towards liquidating the accident, said a press release of the local mayor's office. Russian Telegram channels report that despite all the efforts to fix the station, nothing works. And locals report that their apartments are getting cold. It's up to minus 12 degrees Celsius outside. There's been a whole series of accidents with utility services in Russia since 2024 started. And again, we could go back to there being a cock-up happening an awful lot, a degraded system due to not enough money, not enough funding being put into energy infrastructure. All the funding is going towards the war effort, right? But you could talk about a 25-year process of kleptocracy where the powers that be and the oligarchs and Kremlin officials and Putin are stealing from the state and not really investing enough in Russia. Or this does all seem to be happening pretty much at the same time. Is this a case of Ukrainian subterfuge going on? Partisan activity? I don't know. But this is happening. So here is one account saying, is Janus K, saying, I want to say a few words, so in Estonian, a few words to say about this map. So what is this map? Well, Rebar, this is such an issue that Rebar has produced a map of energy issues within sort of Moscow and all around Russia. So this is that big a problem that Rebar are reporting on it in a formal manner. It was published a few days ago, so a few days old, the Rebar map. Russian mill bloggers by Russians for Russians. Rebar publishes some content in English too, but I couldn't find an English version of this. The title says, Municipal Utilities Disaster in Moscow Area and Other Russian Cities, January 2024. So remember, this is for their Russian audience, really, and it's not propaganda. So, again, this is them admitting, like I've said before, enemy attestation. When Fighter Bomber talks about lost Russian aircraft as a fighter pilot with the Russians, then it's true. When Rebar reports this, it's true, and it means this is bad. They don't specify what kind of utilities exactly, but we can assume it means heating, maybe also some water supply, sewage, electricity, but given the reason, I'd say most likely heating. The word catastrophe, disaster in Russian is quite strong in the Russian language. Russians don't throw this word around lightly. We know that there are at least 3 factors contributing to Russian utilities problems. 1, Russian budget increasingly allocated to aggression war, which means spending reduced in other areas, including utilities maintenance, exactly what I said earlier. 2, what little budget is left continues to be stolen because of corruption. What I said earlier. I haven't read this, by the way. 3, there are no staff available for utilities maintenance and repairs because they're being mobilized and meat cubed. I'm not making this up. It's a fact, not just wishful thinking. Really good, because that's a formal fallacy, the wishful thinking fallacy. And that's interesting that he recognizes this, so I like that. We have seen reports from Russian Telegram how in some cities there are literally no skilled service workers available for utilities repairs. That is important. This is connected to the war. What to make of these facts? You could think that Russia is about to collapse, or you could think that it has zero effect. I think both of these extremes are wrong, and the truth is somewhere in between. Yep, pretty normal there. Russia is not about to collapse due to utilities problem, because Russian people are used to taking a lot of abuse and maltreatment, and Russian authority is used to dealing with the people's whining and complaints, mostly by doing nothing about it. But also, the above 3 factors are compounding this year worse than usual, and it is increasingly hard for the Russian authorities to just ignore this. For me, there are 2 outcomes going forward. 1, we should continue to share the local stories of Russian misfortunes and mock and ridicule Russia and Russians based on that. That's actually what I'm doing. I'm not overtly going out to mock and ridicule them, but I am reporting it because I do think it's important. I think we need to communicate this. I posted a longer thing about this the other day regarding Russia's egg troubles. Psychologically, Russia and Russians have a soft spot for being laughed at. An empire that cannot provide the very basics like winter heating to its people is a complete laughing stock. But this will not have any direct, real and quick impact on events in the real world. 2, I think Russia is heading for some kind of black swan event that will have a real impact, and these utility problems are a contributing factor to that. I have no idea what kind of event or exactly when it will happen. The whole point of Black Swan events is that no one knows. Winter continues for a few months, and we can expect to see more of this. And of course, none of this changes anything about how the West must provide more military assistance to Ukraine more quickly to help Ukrainian defenders fighting. I think it's a really good post, and it is also why I'm continuing to report this stuff. It fascinates me as well. I can't believe, like, if this stuff was going on in the UK, it would be an absolute PR disaster, because we live in a democracy. And so in a democracy, a government can't afford to have stuff like this happen. So they will fight tooth and nail to make sure that this is sorted out as soon as possible. Not so much for their own citizens, of course, but largely because if they don't, they're going to lose power. Now, in a dictatorship, that doesn't happen. So this kind of crap goes on a daily, weekly basis. And yeah, it's a problem, but it's not a problem that is existential to the ruling party or to Putin, because he ain't going to be voted out. And so the Russians also have learnt to just put up with this kind of crap routinely, and so things don't get sorted. Right, then we can go back to the civilian aviation industry. 3 accidents in 6 hours. Russian airlines break new records due to the lack of certified maintenance. On January the 12th, 3 breakdowns occurred in Pobeda Airlines flights in just 6 hours, according to Russian mass media. An alarm was declared on the Cheboksary airport after the flight arriving from Moscow landed. The cause was a fire in the main landing gear. The plane was towed from the runway in the aircraft parking area. 2, flying over the Omsk region, the crew of the Moscow-Bernal flight reported a failure on the right onboard inertial system. The plane also signaled that it was impossible to perform an automatic landing. As a result, the aircraft landed in Novosibirsk. 3, pilots on the Moscow-Ufa flight reported the smell of burnt wiring in the toilet while flying over Chuvashia region. The plane nevertheless landed in Ufa. At this rate, the only real extreme sports fans will soon dare to use Russian airlines. The International Civil Aviation Organization conducted a flight safety audit last year. As a result, Russia was red flagged in the organization's report, along with Bhutan, Congo, and Liberia. In this classification, such a mark means insufficient regulatory oversight. In response, the Russian Ministry of Transport said that the safety of airplane flights in Russia meets international standards. Of course, this will have an effect on insurance, then and the ability, possibly, I don't know, I'm speculating, I don't know enough about this, but the ability for these planes to land in foreign airports. If they don't meet regulatory requirements, if they don't get insurance, then this might be a problem going forward. Russia in oil and gas revenues in 2023 fell by 24% from the previous year to 8.8 trillion rubles, which is equivalent to $100 billion. Gas exports revenue collapsed by 65%, says Igor Sushko. Here, I don't know about this fire at that refinery. I don't know if that's something that's happened recently or whether he doesn't make comment on that. But, things are not looking good from an economic point of view from the Russians, something that Joe Blogs is consistently talking about the ruble, being in trouble, talking about reserves being in trouble. He's done another video on the civil aviation industry, actually. His yesterday video on the absolute collapse of the civil aviation industry for all the reasons we've been talking about, or maybe the imminent collapse. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But, they are failing to export oil and gas at the rates that they are predicted, and are producing them at, rates that is not conducive to making large profits. So it's a real problem for them. Now, just to move away from internal Russian issues and on to frontline claims. So this is a massively anecdotal point being made here, so take it with a pinch of salt. But a photojournalist has interviewed a guy from 25th Separate Siecheslav Airborne Brigade, visited these paratroopers and asked them what tactics are the invaders using, and quote, "They're like brainless goats. That's their tactic. They don't have a tactic at all," noted the Ukrainian defender. Obviously says more than that, but there is this idea that the Russians are just trying to do the same thing over and over. They aren't really trying anything new, and they are getting massively degraded and attrited. And the Ukrainians are like, when the Ukrainians do get overrun, it's because of the tactic of just overwhelming them quite often. I'm not saying this is what happens all the time. There are some good maneuvers that do take place with better trained Russian troops, but there are also areas of the front line where the Russians are just sending in waves and not using particularly good tactics, and the Ukrainians are recognizing this. I like brainless goats, he says. There are no tactics. However, having said all that, the Russians are planning a new offensive, as according to the ISW. Russia is preparing to launch a new offensive in the coming weeks, on the ground in southern and the ground in southern and eastern Ukraine freezes, the Institute for the Study of War reported in their daily assessment. So we'll pop into that a little bit later today. And finally, the Russian government has hidden a vast amount of data from the public in an apparent attempt to conceal the impact of the war in Ukraine. And an analysis shows that almost 500 data sets have been removed since February 2022, covering everything from weather to state pensions. The Russian publication, to be precise, reports that at least 44 government bodies have stopped publishing data. This is a massive red flag. So if the official statistics stop being produced, it means the official statistics suck. The only reason for that, with some statistical platforms, or at least the only plausible reason, being taken down entirely. The law was changed in February 2023 to allow the government to stop publishing state statistics. So if the government is having to change the law so that they can not produce state statistics, in other words, that they want to not be transparent, then this says all you need to know about the Russian government and where they're at the moment. They don't want to be transparent. They want to be more dictatorial and authoritarian, and they don't want their own people to find out anything about this, and they don't want foreign entities to find out anything about what's actually taking place in the government. Much of the data has been removed or suspended from publication relates to direct or indirect indicators of the war's impact. Such data sets were often used by independent Russian commentators and analysts. They include data showing the impact of sanctions, including imports, exports, oil production and refining. Information on companies subject to sanctions, companies involved in military production, and companies working in import substitution. Government procurement and contracts and budget expenditures, data relating to deaths and disabilities caused by the war. Almost all data is on prisoners, many of whom have died after being recruited to fight in Ukraine. Monthly data on crimes committed with the use of firearms, ammunition and explosives, which had increased greatly in Russian regions bordering Ukraine. Data on atmospheric altitude conditions were deleted following drone attacks on Moscow. Data on potential strategic targets such as power plants, power lines and radioactive waste storage sites, as well as regional offices of governmental departments. Information on energy consumption, which could be used to infer the state of the economy, data on migration and the issuing of passports to residents of occupied regions of Ukraine, and at least 40 Russian government websites are now inaccessible to non-Russian IP addresses, likely in an attempt to prevent them being targeted by DDoS. Those are where websites get overwhelmed by thousands of bots in a hacking attempt to bring a website down. Anyway, to stop that from happening abroad. This is hugely important. Like, I love little nuggets like this. So Chris O'Wiki's done a really good job to compile that here. This is massively important. Like, for those who are saying, oh, the Russian economy is fine, it's not a problem, not understanding that the Russians, or at least not wanting to admit that the Russians are falsely propping up the economy, and all the indicators are that Russia is in trouble. And then when Russia then formally changes the law so that they can take those indicators down, or at least the communication of those indicators down, so there's no messaging on formal messaging on statistics, you know things are bad. Things are bad in Russia, and this is as good a signal of things being bad in Russia as anything. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate all your support. Hopefully that was useful and informative to you. Please continue to share these videos as much as you can to overcome. So my video last night was restricted when I did my extra video, because I used the National Socialist word too much, I think, and they don't like that. And those YouTube bots come out saying, you can't use the NAZI word, even though I was talking about it in genuine kind of reporting ways. I'm not like glorifying anything, far from that. I'm decrying it, but apparently you can't talk about it without being restricted. So, you know, if you can share these videos, I really appreciate that. And please click on that subscribe button and click the drop down menu, change it to all, and that really helps. Anyway, take care. Toodle pips.